On this video, we are going to go over how to create a feature out of a table that contains addresses and also coordinates, XY coordinates, latitude, longitude coordinates. And we will start off with a DBase file. It could also be a CSV file that will contain, in this case, addresses and coordinates. You don't have to have, you can only have, you can have one or the other. You can have addresses or you can have coordinates, and then any other relevant field that you want to include with that information, or you can build upon that data. So just for a demo, we'll go through and I already have in here locations of the Springfield fire stations in town, and we'll go ahead and create points to those, and we'll get started. So the first thing we want to do is right click on that, and that will give us options of what we want to do with that table. In this case, we want to do one or the other. We want to either, since we have XY information in there, we want to go ahead and display the XY data, otherwise create point feature from the XY values. If you name your fields XY or either latitude or longitude, the software will understand what to do with that information. So we'll go ahead and select display XY data from here. And this dialog will let us know that, hey, your data is coming from this information from that table. This is the name of the feature that we're going to create. It's going to store in the file geodatabase that we have, and that's the name that it's going to give. For the X field, it's going to use the longitude field from that table, and then the Y field will use latitude. So the X is always going to be your longitude, and the Y will be your latitude. And we will define the coordinate system, and in this case, since the information that we have on there is in geographic, we will go ahead and set that. So we'll go to North America and then USA territories, and then we'll use the North American datum of 1983. And we'll go ahead and hit OK on that one, and then hit OK there. And then it'll go through that process and create a feature. Now, when that data is created, by default, I have it set not to display. So I check that box, and then here's what we have in terms of creating a point feature, but we're not done yet. This is referred to as an event table. And how do we know that? Well, when we look at the properties for this, and then we look at the source, and the source in here is a file geodatabase, and the feature class is, it's a simple point, so it is. So a feature class has been created for that data, and it's stored in the file geodatabase there. And there we have our feature database, and we can also confirm by going to our database. Go ahead and refresh that data, and there we have the feature that's been generated. So what happens if we don't have the coordinates for our data? All we have is just a list of addresses. Well, the other option that we had was a geocode table. So we have a table. We're going through this process of geocoding, which is fairly the same thing. The end goal is to create a feature out of it, and we'll go ahead and do that. And this is just the dialog. It'll kind of give you an idea of all the steps that's required for this entire process. And we'll go ahead and start that. And then what we'll do is we'll open up that table so we know the contents of that table. So we have an address field, and we also have a zip code field. We don't have a city or a state, but that information will be enough to do what we need to do. And then in here, we're just indicating that that information is going to come from more than one field. Go ahead and next. And it's this question, input locator. It's asking us what reference do we need or are we going to use to determine where this address information is going to locate itself against. And then we'll go ahead, and since we're logged into our organizational account, and we'll just use the service provided by ArcGIS Online to go through the geocoding process. We'll do that, and then we'll go to next. And in here, it's asking us to identify the fields that relate to these locator fields, address fields. So we have address and zip code. So for the zip, we don't have any zip plus 4. So we'll go ahead and use that for the zip code. So the zip information will use the zip code field from our table. The address or place field is going to use the address field from our table. Now, if we had cities and even county information or even state, we can use that as well. But since we only have zip code, that is good enough for what we need to do. Now, granted, if we didn't have the zip code, we just had address information, it would be pretty impossible to identify where these addresses are, because we don't have a second identifier to be able to pinpoint where they are on Earth. So we'll go ahead and go to the next step. Now, the name of the feature that it's going to create, it's going to call it Springfield, Illinois, or IL Fire Stations Geocoded, and it's going to, this is checked by default, add output to the map after it's done, and it's going to, by default, we have routing location and address location. We'll stick with the routing location. The differences between address location and routing location is the routing location will allow for driving directions per se, so that we put that address on Google Maps, it'll place that point to the street rather than to the location of the building, and that location of the building would be the address location. Go to next. And then we'll just select country, scroll down and go next. And then it's going to ask us the categories of information, and we'll just use the street address and postal, primary postal information, and then the coordinate system, we'll just say lat-long. Finish. And then this is just confirming all the information that we selected, and we're going to hit that run. So what it's doing now is going through the process of geocoding. It's letting us know that out of our 12 records, remember it starts at 0, so that 0 to 11 is through 12 records, and it tells us that all of our records matched completely, and this is like the time it took. And do we want to rematch? Now, at this point, we don't want to rematch because all of our records have been geocoded. Let's say several of those records in that rematch, and we can go through the process and relocating where those addresses are. And that percent rate of match may be lower than what we've set, and then we can just kind of identify which is closest to that address that we have based on the address from the locator information. And at this point, we don't want to rematch. And and if you blinked, that's too fast, and it saved that file to the personal or to the file view database, and also added that layer back into to the map. So now we can go ahead and turn that off. I'm going to switch the base map to imagery so we can kind of pinpoint those, change the symbology of those, and that. Close that. So now we can go to one of those locations, and so the red has been geocoded to the street, and the blue is where the building is, based on the XY location. Go through some of the results in here. Some of them are slightly off. So it looks like on this one, the XY is actually more accurate than the geocoding. You can see what the attribute table tells us. Let's see. It tells us that the score is relatively good based on the information that was given to that. But on second glance, the geocoded location is slightly off compared to the XY location in here. So when going through the geocoding process, you have to make sure that the locator that you're using is a valid and a good source, because you can have these problems of identifying where the correct locations of these features are. And with that, that's how you would use either DisplayXY data or geocoding a table. Granted, these are only a small record, but the larger number of features that you have or records that you have, the longer it will take to go through that process of either creating the XY or creating a feature from the coordinates, or going through the geocoding process. And the geocoding process will create an extra step by giving you the option of rematching for those records that are matched lower than what you've set for a score.